Welcome back, everybody. Hands-on Apologetics. We're chatting with Vanessa Forsblad, talking about youth and discussing the faith with youth, answering objections and questions. Vanessa, before we begin, I love that story about your prayer to Mother Cabrini to find a parking spot. And, you know, that's one of the cool things about being Catholic is God has a sense of humor, and so do saints. So now you're parking at her church. I mean, talk about hospitality, right?
Exactly. I had not even considered that, but you're so right. Now, you know what? I don't drive, but I always do have a parking spot technically at the church because I work there. So
There you
that's
go.
hilarious. Yeah. But yes. So before the break, I was bringing up a story about Mother Caprini and that she would. So the parish is like right here, and my offices are over here. So if I have to walk to the church, I have to walk outside and walk on the street to the parish. And Burbank is a beautiful area. And so as I'm walking from the church, I see the mountains and I try to relate to her and I see them. I'm like, wow, this is what Italy was like, but this is like where a saint walked. And then I look up and I see Cartoon Network. There's like a massive building for Cartoon Network right down the street from me. And so I'm like, wow, she's like looked up at the mountains and saw Italy. And I see Cartoon Network. And I kind of found that kind of humorous. And so I was thinking about it throughout these months that I've been working at my job. And I received an email or a comment from someone or a message on social media. I can't remember. But someone said to me that they enjoy the fact that when I talk about my life, I'm very transparent about difficulties I've dealt with, you know, like with disordered eating or other temptations I've dealt with in my life, and that it helps him understand the faith. And I was kind of a little confused as to what he meant by that. And he went on to explain that we read about the saints in like books like this one, all the saints. I brought all these books. I have to show some of them off. But all the saints, we read about the saints. And he mentioned that we read about them typically after the fact, like after their struggles or after they dealt with the temptations and they came to God, and that it feels like they're so distant from us. And so he said that when he hears about my story or he hears me talk about the faith, that it's almost like seeing a saint among them. And I would I don't think that I will be recognized as a saint, and all of us should strive for sainthood, but that's not like one of my goals in life to be like, yeah, I want my name to be in a book as Vanessa Forsblad, a saint, but recognizing that people see saints among us. So I'm like thinking about Mother Caprini and how she walked these hills and saw the mountains, and that how I am striving for sainthood, and we all should strive for sainthood. Maybe I'm seeing the building of Cartoon Network, and it's not so much about what I'm seeing, but how is the life that I'm living for God? How is the life that I'm living being lived for God? And recently, I was approached by one of the parents of my students, and they had done all their sacraments at a different church, and they mentioned that they really were happy that they moved over to the parish that I work at because they've seen such a change in their daughter about their love for God. And so I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I've done nothing special in my teaching. Like I'm reading from a textbook a lot of the times, because if not, I'll go off on tangents. And so I'm reading from my notes a lot of the time. I have snacks, but I don't know what I'm teaching any different that is making this like extreme change in the daughter. And so it made me realize that we ourselves need to be a little more humbled. We, as in myself, but like catechists need to be maybe a little more humbled in their teaching and not have this extreme expectation of our youth, but they have this extreme understanding, but that we need to approach them where they need to be met and understand that they deal with struggles and temptations, and they may have questions about things that they may be scared to ask their parents or their friends about, or to whether or not they would be considered dumb. But it made me realize that I'm kind of curious as to what is happening at the other parishes when it comes to teaching about the faith. Are they just throwing information at them, or they have these extreme expectations for them? Because like I mentioned, I don't do anything crazy. I crash into the desks a lot of the time. I run around the classrooms and I do dumb things. And so maybe I'm condescending myself down to them. Maybe they're like, oh, this airhead Vanessa, maybe that's why this information is sticking. But I just think that we need to take a look at ourselves and see and not expect so much of the people around us, because they are like little people emerging in the faith and growing in the faith and understanding that this is not their graduation, this is not the end when they get confirmed, and that it's truly a relationship with God, but in the way that God intended us to have a relationship with him.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's a hard thing to communicate. Like you said, you really have to, it involves a change in your life and your attitude and how you look at things, and being willing to be humble and, and make yourself vulnerable in some ways.
Yeah, it's so true. And just recognizing that they are fellow saints among us as well.
Yeah.
And that we are all called to sainthood. And when we look at people who are key figures in the church that we know the names of, for instance, like St. Paul, we read his letters and we're like, wow, St. Paul must have not had any difficulties. But no, he persecuted the Christians because he thought that that was the way that God wanted to be worshipped. But then he came to learn that that wasn't the right way. And so we have to see ourselves in these figures in the church. And I know that may seem like, oh, that's not us being humble, but we need to recognize that they were also Christians who dealt with temptations, who were tempted, who were maybe lied to in some way or ignorant in some other way, and that we can relate to them and we can see our lives, we can see ourselves in their lives. And so we can look at other saints in the church who also dealt with things like the Father Stu movie came out about, I don't even remember the movie. I don't know why I brought it up. But he had his own temptations and his struggles before he came to be a priest. And so even though we may never get that name attachment of, oh, Saint Vanessa or Saint this or Saint that, we can still strive for sainthood and understand that we need to be holy because God is holy and he calls us to be holy. And that these are not just teachings so that he can just control us. We have free will. We choose him every single day. We have the choice to choose him. But the beauty is that we choose him, and he chose us, and he created us, and he created us in his image. And we need to recognize that in ourselves, but also in the people around us who may seem like they are farthest from God, because they may actually be so close to him. And that it brings us back to that teaching about oh God, why didn't you save me type of thing. Is I did. I sent you this, I sent you that, but you said, no, you're waiting on me. And so we need to live our lives out for God, but not just stand around and expect some miracle to happen, though it could, but reach out to God and have a relationship with God as he intended us to have with him. And so that's something I can hit home with my students all the time. As I'm learning from my studies, they teach me every day what it is to be a true Christian and what it is to love with their innocence and everything that they have. I was telling my parish that they make me cry sometimes because they really show me day in and day out what the love of God is. And I see God through them. And it's something that I often have to recognize, even sometimes when I'm telling them to be quiet because I'm talking.
Yeah, right. Yeah. What age group do you do confirmation classes?
I have freshmen and sophomores in the United States, so that's around 14 to 16-year-olds. And then I'm also running youth ministry, so that goes up to 18. And we had a meeting 2 weeks ago. We actually have a meeting this evening. We had a meeting 2 weeks ago, and I had this entire lecture prepared. I was like, I'm going to teach them about St. Paul. And next thing I know, we're sitting down eating pizza, just talking about the struggles of our lives and things that we're dealing with and questions that we may have. And I recognize that a lot of times they just need to talk, and they need to talk their way out of things, or they need someone to listen because maybe they're not being provided that all the time. And so that's something that I'm also learning, that it's not so much heavy lecture stuff that they need, but sometimes they just need to know what it's like to experience love from another individual in the form of charity, in the form of listening or quality time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they just need guidance, like mentor, that they can, like you said, they kind of talk their way through things. And sometimes they just need somebody to listen and maybe contribute a little here and there, but they don't need somebody to, download a whole lesson on what all the different aspects. That's what I would do. That's
Me too.
That's one of those things I got to hold back on, is because you just want to. Okay, guys, here's the lecture. Here's the notes. Here's the quiz.
I love stuff like that, but I understand that not everyone likes to learn that way. If I ask a question, I want a whole lecture. I love information overload, but I understand that I'm the only one, because some people get tired. And one time, in the story that I was teaching, or I wanted to teach my students last week about St. Paul, is that in this lesson, they were mentioning that St. Paul was teaching someone that the person got so bored to death that they fell out of a window. And I can't remember the exact Bible teaching that they were talking about. And I was just like, that's me. I would bore someone to death that they fall out of the window with all this information overload. So
I don't think so.
I'm learning more and more to break it down and to really humble myself, but also recognize that a lot of people just want to know some basic information and not the whole history of how we got there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, think of it this way. One of your students might be at a juncture where they could do some serious sin or something that make a shipwreck of their faith. What difference does it make whether they understand St. Paul at that point? They need counseling right then and there. So you're right. It's this beautiful cooperation between us and God. You got to have your ears and eyes open and kind of see where God's pointing you. Sometimes they need to know about Paul. Sometimes they need to eat pizza and talk about their life.
It's so true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, we're coming up to the end of the program. I want to give a plug for all your outlets. Tell us, how people can get a hold of you and your information.
So, as always, you can find me on the internet under That One Catholic Girl. I haven't been so much on social media just because I've been overwhelmed with school and work. Sure. But I'm excited for how many years I'll be in school. I'm not too sure. I'm hoping for 2. I'm hoping that at the end of these 2 years that all of the information that I'm gaining will be fruitful to my audience. So if you can bear with me for 2 years, in 2 years, I'm going to be back and better than ever. So I hope so. Keep me in your prayers. But you can find me on all my social media websites, and you can always reach out to me on those websites. I'm always wanting new things to pray for. So send me your intentions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Vanessa. We appreciate it.
Thank you.